Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. In this video, I'll be talking about history of artificial neurons as a subtopic of the history of deep learning. Just to clarify how the mathematical model of a neuron relates to these first logic functions is just a quick overview. So you have drawn these three labels and an OR and NOT table representing these different types of first order logic functions. So how this works is you can think of x1 and x2 as the inputs and y as the output. So if both the inputs are 0, the output is 0, and if one of the inputs is 0, then the output is still 0, and you have to have both the inputs equal to 1 to have an output of 1. That's usually how an AND function works. For the OR function, it's sufficient for one of the inputs to be 1 to output a 1, and the NOT function, it's just the inverse basic. So if the input is 0, then the output is 1, and if the input is 1, then the output is 0. So here we are talking about binary values. So the possible values are only zeros and ones here, like a bit function. For example, like representing one bit of information. So here this relates, and this would be the a mathematical way to implement an AND function with analogies to this biological neuron. So we have these inputs x1 and x2 and then the output. So we will revisit this in way more detail in the next videos when we talk about the perceptron models. So I mean, not in that much more detail, but we will actually implement this also in the code in a way that it automatically learns weights to make classifications here. It's just showing that it's actually indeed possible to use this idea of biological neurons to implement such a function, and this would work by having these inputs here, and then you integrate these inputs by summing over them. So you would have here the sum over these inputs, and then there is a threshold. So we can think of this threshold as something you have to reach in order to fire or not, in order to relay a signal or not. So in that way, it's basically, you can think of it as a piecewise linear function, so where it returns 1 if the inputs, let's say x1 plus x2, are greater than the threshold, let's say greater than or equal to and 0 otherwise. This would be our neuron here. So there are also some weights. Notice that I set them to 1 here, so they are actually not doing anything. Usually you would compute a weighted sum of the inputs, but we are not worrying about that right now, right here. So one would basically say that the weights have no function here, so we can actually ignore them here. Otherwise, instead of x1 plus x2, it would be the weighted input. It would be w1 times x1 plus w2 times x2, but since the weights were 1, they are not doing anything. So in this case, we can also ignore them. Later we will actually talk about the ways we can actually learn these weights, like parameterize the model. And then I don't want to spend too much time here, but if you like, you can just plug in different values like 0 and 0, 1 and 0, 0 and 1, and 1 and 1, and see what the weighted sum is, or the sum x1 plus x2, and see whether it's bigger or smaller than the threshold. And then you can realize that this will be implementing on an AND function. And similarly, you can implement an OR function by changing the threshold to 0.5, and you can also implement a NOT function by, for example, changing the threshold to minus 0.49 and having the weight of -1. So this is already too much detail maybe, but this would be an example of how the mathematical neuron model could represent AND, OR, and NOT functions. Moving on, so in the previous slide I talked about the model, but there was no way we could determine the threshold automatically, so we would have to hand code this threshold for specific functions. But now let's say you are given a data set and you want to learn a classifier, so you would have to maybe try out a lot of these weights and thresholds to find a good way to classify data. So one idea was done by Frank Rosenblatt to develop a learning algorithm. If I go back one slide, a learning algorithm that can find optimal weights and thresholds automatically from the data to make a good classification. So if you want to classify data, so for example, if you want to classify spam and not spam email, you could use, for example, a system that can learn from data to find a good decision threshold. So this was by Frank Rosenblatt, and only 1 decade later, approximately 1 decade after the McCulloch and Pitts neuron. Also, I should mention here that there are multiple perceptron algorithms. However, in practice, usually we say the perceptron algorithm. So although there are multiple ones, there is one popular perceptron algorithm, and we will talk about this perceptron algorithm in the later videos in more detail and also implement it in the code. But here's just a quick overview of how this works and how it looks like. So similar to the previous slide, we have multiple inputs. There are also these weights and they get combined. So this is a weighted sum here at this point. So it's called a net input function. And then there's an activation function. This is basically our threshold and that I introduced in the previous slide. And yeah, then it will produce an output. So 0 or 1. We will again talk about this in way more detail. So it's just a quick overview. And here would be, if you are interested, this would be how it actually looked like in practice, because back then computers were quite different. So it's actually a physical machine and people had to plug in wires to make it work and rearrange the wires and stuff like that. So we have come a long way with computations. Alright, and then also after the perceptron, we are still talking about single layer neural network. After this perceptron, there were the so-called Adaline, which stands for adaptive linear neuron, by Widrow and Hoff in 1960. It's only 3 years later, you can check. And what is the difference between perceptron and Adaline? So this one is now differentiable neuron model. So that changes a little bit how we learn on the weights. So it's like a little more convenient to learn the weights, because now we can use calculus to learn the weights. And then in the future videos we will also talk, of course, about gradient descent, like using calculus to learn the weights. So here's this just our quick last overview of this for this video. So this is the perceptron I've shown you, and now the Adaline is actually very similar. So it is shown here at the bottom, and here the only or the main difference is that there is no linear activation function. And so in the perceptron you do a classification, then you get an output here, and then based on the error you compute the error by comparing this output to the true label. So you have a true label, and then you compare the two, and based on this you can see whether you make an error or not. If you make an error, you go back and update these weights. And for the Adaline, the difference is you have this update before you have this threshold function, before you compute the actual output. So lastly, why do we have deep learning nowadays? Why didn't we stop now with perceptrons and Adaline? Well, apparently because we have no classifiers that can be easily parameterized. Well, the problem with these is that they can only learn very simple decision boundaries. So you can only learn so-called binary decision boundaries. So binary decision boundary is a decision boundary that splits a data into two halves. So if you have a classification problem, well, let's sketch this up here. So if we have a classification problem with two features, x1 and x2, and one class is, let's say, these circles here, and the other class are these plus signs here, and I want to classify them. So while we train a binary classifier, it might be to learn a decision boundary that looks like this here, and everything left will be classified as a plus and everything to the right will be classified as a circle. So this is a binary decision boundary. But now if we have for example XOR problem, so XOR is an exclusive OR, and it might look like this here at the bottom. So here I have two classes here. I have minuses and pluses. So there are these minuses and pluses, but look at how they are arranged. They are kind of like arranged like an X here, right? You can see that. So a binary classifier would not be able to solve this problem, but a binary decision boundary, you can draw it maybe like this. But then if we draw it like this, we make a lot of mistakes, right? It get these minuses right to the left and everything to the right, let's say, is a plus sign, but then it gets these here wrong. So that's a problem. Well, another way we can draw this decision boundary might be like this. Let's say like this, but again we make mistakes here. So there's no way, if you try it out in practice, if you try different combinations, there's no way we can classify these points here correctly using this binary classifier. Now let's start with the artificial neuron. So the single layer neural network, it all goes back to McCulloch and Pitts. The neuron model they developed around 1943, which is the mathematical formulation of a biological neuron that could solve or and not problems. So these are first order logic problems or functions, and you have maybe heard about them in introductory computer science classes on the first order logic or in mathematical classes. So the first this fundamental and not building blocks. So a biological neuron, you don't really have to know about that, because deep learning and neural networks were inspired by how the human brain works. And yeah, to be honest, they were quite different from each other. So you can also think of it as, let's say, a submarine and a fish. So humans were inspired by how a fish can dive underwater or go underwater, so they developed a submarine which can do the same thing. However, a submarine works very differently from a fish overall. I mean, there are some analogies. However, of course, the submarine is very different from a fish. Or think about a bird and an airplane. So both can fly. Bird flaps its wings to fly, airplane doesn't. So but there are still some analogies. So airplanes are inspired by birds, but they are not necessarily the same. And this also applies, of course, to neurons and models of neurons. But of course, the goal of building an airplane is to build something useful. And if you make it more like a bird, it doesn't necessarily make it more useful. And the same is also true for neural networks. We can maybe make them more similar to a neuron brain, but give them some properties that human brains have, but it doesn't imply that they would be better at solving certain problems. Well, they might not be. And also, to be honest, the real challenge is not is no one really knows how exactly the human brain works, so we can't really replicate it yet. But let me not get distracted, and let's get back to the topic here. Just briefly about the biological neuron. So the biological neuron looks like as follows. So this is of course a sketch, but yeah, the takeaway is that there are some input signals here that are received by the neuron. So you have these right here where input signals are received. These are dendrites. So there's a cell nucleus where some integration of the information happens, some processing of the information, and then this information is transferred to the so-called axon terminal. So the signal comes in here, there's some computation happening, and then it goes to the axon terminal. Actually it would jump, it's like an electrical signal here, but this detail doesn't really matter. What important is that this results in an output signal. And in a human brain, for example, or in other types of brains of animals, the neurons are connected to other neurons. So they are usually like there would be another neuron sitting right here receiving these signals as inputs. So these output signals would be the input signals of another neuron and so forth. But then this would be more like a multi-layered neural network. Here we are just thinking about a single neuron. And of course also there are many types of neurons in our brains, so there is not only one type. Here we are just thinking of a very simple version where we have input signals and one, let's say, output signal. So we can think of whether the neuron is activated or not, whether it fires or not, and with that concept we can implement a so-called and, or, and not first order logic function.